Now let's delve into chemical bonding. A group of atoms that are held together by energy in a stable association is called a molecule. When the molecule contains atoms of more than one element, it's called a compound. Atoms are held together in molecular compounds by chemical bonds. These chemical bonds can come in a couple of different forms. There are ionic bonds, in which atoms are attracted to each other because of their opposite charges. And then there are covalent bonds, where atoms share electrons. And we'll also consider hydrogen bonds later in the chapter. We'll start by considering the ionic bond. Ionic bonds are formed by the attraction of oppositely charged ions. So a sodium atom has how many electrons? Its atomic number 11. So 2 electrons in the inner shell plus 8 here, that brings us to 10. So there will be 1 electron in its outermost shell. Chloride is atomic number 17, so let's fill those shells. There's 2 plus 8 in the next shell, and that brings us to 10, and 7 in the outermost shell. So chlorine has a strong desire to fill its electron shell. So it's going to steal an electron from someone in order to fill that. And sodium, well, the electron in his outer shell isn't nearly as tightly attached, so sodium's actually willing to give up that electron. So sodium atom loses an electron and becomes Na+, and the chloride ion gains an electron, a negative charge, so it becomes Cl-. Now we have a positively charged sodium ion and a negatively charged chloride ion. And as you know, opposite charges attract. So that's what holds sodium and chloride together in its crystalline form. We call this an ionic compound. Now, the electrical attraction of water molecules can disrupt these forces that hold the ions together. We'll explore that shortly. Before we do, let's look at covalent bonds. They're distinctly different and much, much stronger than ionic bonds because the electrons in this case are physically shared. Covalent bonds form when atoms share 2 or more valence electrons. You can see this example here with hydrogen. Hydrogen is atomic number 1, so it has 1 electron in its outer shell. Now, in that very first shell, remember that we need to have 2 electrons to achieve a state of stability. And so hydrogen ions will share their electrons. And now, in essence, this hydrogen ion has 2 electrons, and so does this. The electrons share equal time between each electron shell. This is a single bond. Most molecules are bonded together with single covalent bonds. However, sometimes we'll see double covalent bonds. Let's look at oxygen as an example. Oxygen is atomic number 8. So it has 2 electrons in its innermost energy shell and 6 electrons in its second shell. In order to be happy, it really needs to share 2 electrons. It needs 2 electrons to fill this outer shell and satisfy the octet rule, as does this oxygen. So when the 2 oxygen molecules come together, they share 2 pairs of electrons. So now we've got these 4 shared electrons plus these 4 owned electrons, bringing us to 8 in the outer shell. The same thing over here. 2 shared pairs of electrons plus 2 of its own brings it to 8 in the outer shell. We denote a double covalent bond with 2 lines in between the atom. On occasion, we'll see triple covalent bonds in nature. This happens between nitrogen, in just the same fashion as we see in oxygen, except now we're sharing 3 pairs of electrons, and there are only 2 dedicated in the outer shell to this individual nitrogen, but there's 6 shared electrons, and so its outer shell is happy. The strength of a covalent bond depends on the number of shared electrons. So a single covalent bond is fairly strong, but naturally a triple covalent bond is very, very strong. In fact, N2 cannot be broken apart except by very few nitrogen-fixing bacteria that we see in the root nodules of some plants. Those bacteria are responsible for fixing all of the N2 that feeds into our ecosystem. Many biological compounds are composed of more than 2 atoms. That means they share electrons with 2 or more atoms. In fact, there could be hundreds of different atoms that come together to form a molecule using these covalent bonds. Most everything is bonded by covalent bonds because they're stronger. So here's a little analogy that might help you understand the difference between ionic and covalent bonding. Imagine that in the case of sodium and chloride and the ionic bond, sodium atom is wearing one small item of clothing on the outside, like a scarf. And the chlorine atom is an individual who has pretty much all of his clothes on, but he would really like a scarf in order to feel complete and content and fully clothed. So the chloride ion runs up to the sodium ion and steals the scarf in order to have a full set of clothes on the outside. The sodium ion, not so happy, so he's going to go chasing after the chloride atom. As the sodium ion chases after the chloride atom, he is slightly positive and going after slightly negative. They stick together. But the scarf remains stolen. Sodium's basically being dragged around by the chlorine atom who won't give the scarf back up or won't give up the electron. On the other hand, when we have covalent bonding, we see that the electron shell on the outside is not satisfied by the octet rule. So rather than the ion going along and stealing and taking away the scarf, they come up and say, hey, can I share that scarf with you? And so they both share the same item of clothing, and in essence now they're both wrapped in the same scarf and both are happy. I don't know if the analogy works for you, but let's watch an animation to make sure that we understand this covalent bonding. At this point, I want to remind you of all the animations that are available in your Connect Plus software package. When you're in Connect, you want to go to your ebook. And when you're in your ebook, you can go to the video tab. We can expand all the little videos. These are lots of animations that may help you understand the content of the chapter. I strongly recommend that you watch all of these animations. They can really help you understand some of the concepts. For now, let's visit one of the additional animations that I've put up here for you under Module 1. You want to click on Contents, and then we can see a list of additional animations that might really help you out. Let's look at this one. This animation will show you the 3 bond types. We'll begin by comparing ionic and covalent.
In living organisms, atoms are joined to form molecules by a few kinds of bonds, mainly ionic, covalent, and hydrogen bonds. Click the buttons to view an animation about each bond type.
We'll begin with ionic.
Sodium atoms and chloride atoms have unfilled orbitals in their outer shells. The lone electron in the outermost shell of a sodium atom can be pulled or knocked out. This ionizes the atom. It is now a positively charged sodium ion. A chlorine atom has an electron vacancy in its outer shell and can acquire another electron. This ionizes the atom to form a negatively charged chloride ion. The 2 oppositely charged ions attract each other. An association of 2 ions with opposing charges is known as an ionic bond. You can observe the outcome of ionic bonding in a portion of a crystal of table salt, or sodium chloride. In such crystals, sodium ions and chloride ions interact through ionic bonds.
Now let's look at covalent.
2 hydrogen atoms, each with an unpaired electron in the outer shell, can pair up to share a pair of electrons. This stabilizes the atoms and forms a single covalent bond. Both nuclei exert the same pull on the electrons, so they are shared equally, and the bond is nonpolar. There is no charge difference between different parts of the molecule. An oxygen atom has 2 electron vacancies in its outer shell. 2 oxygen atoms can share 2 pairs of electrons, forming a double covalent bond. Again, the electrons are distributed equally and the bond is nonpolar. Alternatively, an oxygen atom can share electron pairs with two hydrogen atoms. Each hydrogen atom shares a single pair of electrons with the oxygen. The molecule is held together by two single covalent bonds. An oxygen nucleus has more protons than a hydrogen nucleus, and so attracts the shared electrons more strongly. This unequal sharing gives the oxygen end of the atom a slight negative charge, and the hydrogen end a slight positive charge. We say that water is held together by polar covalent bonds.
And that is the perfect segue into our next topic. In order to think about polar covalent bonds, we need to understand a little about electronegativity, which is an atom's affinity for electrons, or how tightly an atom holds onto those electrons. The differences in electronegativity are what dictate how the electrons are distributed in the covalent bonds. Like in that example, in the previous example, oxygen had a larger draw on the electrons than did the hydrogen ions. In general, electronegativity increases as we go across the table and drops off as we go down the columns. So this top right-hand corner is what contains the most electronegative atoms. They have the highest draw for electrons. Oxygen is the most electronegative biological atom. Nonpolar covalent bonds involve equal sharing of electrons, so atoms of equal electronegativities trying to share the electrons, versus polar is unequal sharing of electrons. In the polar covalent bonds, we end up with a slight negative charge on one end of the molecule and a slight positive charge on the other end of the molecule. We'll see that this has some implications on how molecules interact with each other. Chemical reactions involve the formation or breaking of chemical bonds. Mostly, we'll be dealing with covalent bonds. The atoms shift from one molecule to another without any change in the number or identity of atoms. You may recognize the equation below as a simplified version of the photosynthesis equation. On this side, we have the reactants. Those are the ingredients that go in. And on the right side, we have the products, the things that come out of the reaction. So in photosynthesis, we have water and carbon dioxide as well as sunlight, and we come out with sugar and oxygen. You'll notice that the arrow is double-headed. Most reactions can go either direction. That is, they are reversible. Chemical reactions rates are influenced by temperature, the concentration of the reactants and products, and by other catalysts that might act to accelerate the reaction. In general, we'll see that temperature speeds up a reaction. Of course, there's a limit to this. At a certain point, the enzymes involved in the reaction, or the proteins, will denature. Concentration of reactants and products definitely has an influence. If there are only so many enzymes or proteins to perform the reaction, that is, to break water and CO2 and recombine them to form these products, then the rate at which we can form the products is limited. If there are more enzymes to perform the task, the rate will go faster. If there are less, it'll go more slowly. So let's see how you're doing with this material. How about a card quiz? What kind of chemical bonds are formed when atoms share one or more pair of electrons? Red is covalent, green, ionic, yellow, hydrogen, or blue, polar bonds. Typically, an increase in temperature causes a rate of the chemical reaction to decrease is green, yellow is increase, or red remain the same. This one's a little bit tougher. Magnesium chloride is a salt formed from ionic bonds between one magnesium ion and two chloride ions. So you'll need to look at your periodic table. The magnesium atoms have 2 electrons in their outer or third shell, and the chlorine atoms have 7 electrons in their outer shell. how many electrons would be in the outer shell of the magnesium once it becomes an ion? So the magnesium is going to lose 2 electrons, 1 to each chloride molecule. Does that make sense? So how many would be left? Yellow, 1, green, 2, red, 6, and blue, 8. What property of an atom determines how it forms bonds? Green, atomic mass, red, atomic number, blue, its valence electrons, or yellow, the neutrons? Here are your answers. Red, yellow, yellow, blue, blue. If you got all of those correct, great job. You're ready to move on to the next section of the chapter. However, before you do, one more diagramming exercise. Now, diagram and explain the difference between an ionic and a covalent bond. Remember, the ionic bond forms from attraction of opposite charges, whereas a covalent involves actual sharing, physically holding on to the same electrons. So choose, let's say, sodium and chloride as your example of an ionic bond, and try and do water, H2O, for your example of covalent bonding.